Hi, I'm Lori.
And I'm Kevin, and this is No Longer Ashamed.
We are survivors of childhood sexual abuse.
And we're here to share with you that if you're a survivor, you don't have to be alone.
Our logo is a salamander, and the reason is a fire salamander can survive a fire, and you have survived a fire.
We want to help you with your journey to healing and hope.
We are all survivors together, and we walk this journey together, and you are not alone.
By telling our stories, we are hoping that you will have the courage to share your stories as well and find your voice.
Because stories are so important, and for so long I know that I wouldn't tell my story, but when I finally shared my story, that's when I got my freedom.
And this is our journey and your journey to healing and hope. So come with us.
Well, we are so excited to have a special guest today, actually two, because Charnell is back with us. And Charnell, we're going to have you introduce our guests since you found this group, and we are so excited to know all the things that they're doing.
Well, this is Sam Dordulian, and he is a personal injury lawyer in LA area. And I found their website. It's the Dordulian Law Group when I was looking up for material for the podcast we did on sports abuse, coaches, trainers, team doctors, because that's a real passion of mine. And I found your law group, Sam, and I just was like so impressed with all the information, the stats. You guys are so thorough. And then I reached out, and Jason is extremely on it and professional. And I was just telling these guys that he responds, he's right on it. And I just really, really appreciate that. And I just really appreciate all the work you're doing, but especially in so much of the sex abuse cases, as these guys are both survivors. And a lot of times we do have people who are telling their story for the first time, and they're telling it on the podcast, but of course it's not live, but they don't know the next step. And they'll say, what can I do legally? And they think because of statute of limitations and things like that, and here in Washington and whatever, that they, have no voice. And it usually takes a person 26 years. Is that right, Lori, to tell their story and come forward. And by that time, a lot of times they have feel like they have no recourse. And I thought your little information thing on that was really good. I was listening to that.
Yeah. Welcome, Sam.
I wanted to thank you for the kind words. My background started with the district attorney's office. That's kind of where I was first exposed to sexual assault type of cases. And I don't know, I kind of say it's more of a calling. I ended up getting chosen to work in the sex crimes unit, where I spent half my career, 13 years at the DA's office. I spent about half that career just doing nothing but sex crimes. And, I saw the ramifications of it. I worked on the criminal side, so I had the opportunity of putting these bad actors away, and it felt great at the time. What I didn't appreciate at the time that I was a prosecutor is that there are other avenues, such as the civil avenue. And at the time, I didn't know anything about it. So all I knew is my criminal prosecution. I knew, if I had the opportunity, I could put some of these bad people away, and I thoroughly enjoyed that experience. And then 2008, I started my own law firm. And to be honest, I had done so many jury trials. I think I was up to over 80 jury trials, wow. Total trials over 100 as a prosecutor. A significant number of sex abuse cases, because again, half my career was just in sex crimes. Spent a year also in the stalking unit doing stalking, so it was somewhat similar and close in tie to these kind of sex crimes cases. So I wanted to take a break, and I decided to do something completely different, walk away from, trials. And, I explored the personal injury side, I explored workers' comp. And at the end of the day, it just drew me right back. I didn't enjoy any of those other types of cases as much as I did when I was a prosecutor prosecuting sex crimes cases. So that's when I decided, why am I running away from the thing that I actually enjoy doing? And why don't I start a firm that focuses and specializes in representing survivors of sexual abuse? So I contacted my detective that I worked with frequently when I was a prosecutor. I knew he was on the verge of retirement, and said, hey, why don't you come and join me on a civil practice? I could definitely use you. He's with LAPD for 30 years, 20 years as a sex crimes detective. brought him on board, I knew I wanted to do something a little different. I knew I wanted to incorporate some of the other elements in sex abuse cases, which is the support, psychological support. So I have victim advocates or trained victim advocates. My wife is a psychiatric social worker, so she works with abused kids. So I have her kind of part-time consulting also with, referrals and places of support that we can send our clients. So I decided, I'm going to create a safe place for people to come and have a different option besides the criminal option. Having been a former prosecutor, I still strongly believe in the criminal justice system, and having survivors, if they're willing to, encourage them to go through that process. Having been a former prosecutor, I can also help them through that process and can offer the civil justice avenue as well. So that's kind of how my firm evolved. I do have a different department that does regular personal injury cases. That's not what I do. I have now just kind of focused in on doing nothing but representing survivors of sexual abuse.
What I noticed on your website was it felt very safe. And I loved the step-by-step process that you present right away. So if somebody was in need, the first thing they would see is, oh, okay, this is what I want to do. And I really like what you said about you encourage them to go through criminal justice, but also that you're there because I used to work in the highest building in Seattle. It was called the Columbia Tower. And we were right across from the jail and the courthouse. And one day we're looking out the one window and there's a woman on top of the sky bridge. She's going to jump because she was in court, had to face her abuser. He was his own lawyer or whatever.
Wow.
And she,
those are the word.
Yeah, they got a break and she got out and she got up on the sky roof. And I mean, they brought her daughter, her little baby daughter to the edge, all these to try to went on all day long. And my heart just broke that somebody would have to go and face their abuser and be questioned by them. It was just horrifying to know that that is something that goes on.
I've experienced the same thing with a lot of my former victims when I was a prosecutor. And it's daunting. It's difficult. It's really important to make sure you talk to your survivors before they take the stand and all the ramifications that will come from it. And as much as sometimes you prepare them, it's not real until they walk into that courtroom. I still remember several cases where, my survivors would walk in and literally in front of the jury, the minute they laid eyes on the perpetrator, drop to the floor and just crying vehemently right in front of the jury. And you work with them. And one particular survivor I won't forget because she had the same experience. She literally dropped to the floor and just started screaming in tears. She was able to muster the strength and courage to get on that stand and tell her story. We got a conviction. And I remember when she walked off, she came and thanked me about how empowering that was. For the first time, she appreciated that man who had control had to just sit there and listen. He had absolutely no control anymore over her. And she was the one in control because she gets to tell her story and he had to shut up and listen. Mm-hmm. And the jury got to hear the story. And it was such a transformative moment for her that it was just awesome to be part of that. So we see that. We know how difficult it is. Unfortunately, the system, they have the resources there, but I don't know if it's properly used. I know the DA's office, LA County DA's office, we have victim advocates. The resources there, but they're not necessarily trained specifically to deal with sexual assault survivors. They're trained to just kind of deal with all type of victims of crime. And they're also don't really appreciate or know, they're not attorneys, what the next step is. So sometimes their guidance isn't as helpful or that our survivors want. So one of the services we offer as well, if we're going to take on the case, is if there is a criminal process, I will help you through that. I've been there. I know exactly what's going to happen, and I will walk you through and answer the questions that maybe you're not getting from the victim advocate or you're not getting from your prosecutor who might be too busy prosecuting those cases. And so I think it's really important to get them to understand what's going to happen so that fear element goes away to some degree.
And I love that you know what's next because, there's so much fear. And I imagine if I was in a court system, I would be triggered going into all the states that we go in to protect ourselves. That would be really hard to stay present. So the fact that you understand that and can help them understand it, see it, and walk through it is really so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's different. Everyone's reaction is different, but it's good to have somebody to kind of walk you through, because, with knowledge comes some element of power, and it's that fear, because you don't know what you're walking into. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how you're going to be treated. You don't know what type of questions are going to be asked, but getting some information about that, I think, helps them cope with the situation and deal with the situation, and walk in there a little bit more ready to confront what's going to be happening in that courtroom.
Yeah.
So if you are a survivor and you do want to prosecute someone, I know it's extremely difficult because often it's just a case of he said, she said, etc. What advice would you give to a survivor as far as how do you corroborate your evidence, so to speak? How do you know that you have a case if you want to try and prosecute someone?
The truth is, it is very difficult to prosecute these cases. And you're right. Unlike many of the other crimes that we see all around us, usually, and people have come to expect, a lot of corroboration, oftentimes in the form of video. There's cameras everywhere. So when there's a robbery, we expect to see that robbery on some form of camera because they're prolific. It's everywhere out there. But these kind of cases are usually behind closed doors. You don't have a camera. You don't have witnesses. So in a 7-Eleven, you're going to have cameras. You're going to have a bunch of people who are probably walking by, and jurors expect that. But these type of cases, it literally sometimes is the survivor saying this happened, and of course the accused will deny it. So you don't have the cameras, you don't have the witnesses, so these cases just inherently, by the nature of the case, is a lot more difficult. But there are ways of corroborating it, and it's oftentimes not really the place for the survivors to think about that. It's the responsibility of the prosecutor to figure that out. And the sad truth is, and having been there for as long as I was, and having seen a lot of my colleagues take on different cases, each day we were assigned to do intake. So if a call came in and it was my day, I reviewed all the cases and made a decision for myself. I used to keep those cases that I file. I'm going to file this case. I'm going to go forward with it. But the reality is, it also just depends on who you get. I may look at that case and go, I'm going to take a chance on this one. And I would go forward with it. But, a colleague of mine sitting in an office next door may choose not to. So it is somewhat luck of the draw of who you're going to get. We had standards at the DA's office. We required independent corroboration. As long as I could find some independent corroboration, I was allowed to file the case. And that could take the form of many different things. And the first thing that I think most jurors think about is, forensic evidence, DNA or something of that nature. And that's oftentimes available if there's an immediate reporting. And all of us who've done this for as long as we have, we know majority don't report immediately. So it's great when it's there, but it's not often there. So if there's an immediate reporting and the police will take you to, get a rape exam, we can collect some forensic evidence, and that could be very, very powerful evidence. There's also sometimes injuries that are consistent with sexual assault that can be documented and photographed. But again, majority of the people don't report for a very long time, and that type of forensic evidence is not always available. There's another doctrine called the fresh complaint doctrine in the law. And what that means is, as long as you went and told anybody, I know majority of people don't report, but they don't usually report to law enforcement. But oftentimes you will have people reporting to a close friend or somebody else that they may make some mention of something that happened, maybe not in details. And that's critical, because that could be a form of independent corroboration. Because if someone immediately told a friend, oh my God, especially if they're in tears, the demeanor of which they report, all of that is very critical and important for me as a former prosecutor to evaluate whether I have some form of corroboration, especially if that other witness will corroborate. Yes, I remember she was, her demeanor, she looked like she saw a ghost, she was in tears or whatever demeanor that they actually testified to. And then they said XYZ happened to them. That could be a form of independent corroboration. One of the strongest forms of independent corroboration, at least I've found in doing my cases, is all other victims. As we have seen in a lot of these cases, these sexual predators, they don't just do it once. They get away with it once, they're going to do it again. And oftentimes you as a survivor think you're alone and you're the only one. But once you make that report, you'll discover, oh no, there's been 2 or 3 other complaints about this guy. And sadly, what happens in prosecution is the first person who usually complains, they look at it just like you said, he said, she said, I don't have independent corroboration. They keep it on file, And not until the second woman complains or the second survivor complains, then finally some action is taken. Now you have independent corroboration. The two separate survivors are independently corroborating each other. Now you have a case. Of course, the second survivor would have no idea if they don't report that they're not alone. But those are other forms of independent corroboration. So there's other ways of looking at things as a prosecutor. Try to find that independent corroboration, statements of the defendant. If it ever gets to that point where it is reported, some detectives like, the investigator I have in-house now, they're great at interviewing these perpetrators. They know the buttons to push, and sometimes even the lies are great, because if I could prove that they're lying about once, important subject, then that's a form of independent corroboration, even if they don't admit it. A lot of times they will admit things, though. A lot of times they will say things thinking they can, talk their way out of it, and they'll give some corroboration, which is enough for me to meet my legal standard, and I get to file. So the job of the survivor isn't to try to figure that out. They're not trained to do that. It is the responsibility of hopefully a competent prosecutor and or a civil attorney who's done this enough times or long enough to be able to see those things and put a case together.
I had a question. So there was this big case in the last year, and I talk about it on the episode that I did on the sports stuff about the basketball coach. And he got in trouble in the first reported in October. And I think it was just two kids on the team that guy gives me the creeps. And then it went from there, right? And he gives me the creeps too. Has he ever yelled up back and forth? Is kind of where it all came out. Well, so from October till last spring or whenever it was, he was in trouble, but he wasn't pulled out of the thing and out of the situation. And the kids would go to a sporting event with their friends, like a Mariners game or a Seahawks game or something, a hockey game, whatever. And the guy would be there like with a booster club, and it had already been brought up. And I know that was in the newspapers, in the Times. It was talked about how frustrating that was for these boys. And this, of course, they didn't do their due diligence on the guy because he'd played like D1 basketball. I think he'd even played in the tournament, the whole thing. He was really good, and they felt like it was a feather in their cap that they got him to be a coach. And so the parents didn't want to believe and all this stuff. But so there's this time from October when it had been reported, and it had been reported, I believe, to the police. And then he stayed, he might've gotten in trouble. I mean, he would be there dropping his kids off at the school, and he would see the boys, and he would, like wave and smirk or whatever. And it was troubling to me. And is there any way to prevent that or be more aggressive to prevent that from happening? Is that just something that he didn't have a good attorney to put a no contact or a no something order? I don't know.
There's all of those things. There's protective orders you can do, but even as a civil attorney, if I don't know the facts of that specific case, but something similar, if I was to get involved in a case, I would want to make sure that especially since I'm probably going to go after his employer, to let him know that, I have every expectation that they're going to take steps and measures to protect not only the children at issue, but all the other children who potentially could be his victims. And there is that responsibility upon an employer once they have some notice that this person can be a danger. And that's really all it takes, is once they have that notice, they have a responsibility to take some form of action. Taking no action is negligent. And that's what allows us now, as a civil lawyer, for me to go after these organizations saying, well, you had some knowledge, you had some notice that this person was a danger. What did you do to protect those kids and any other future kids? What measures you put in place to have a monitor, make sure that he doesn't do anything inappropriate? What measures you put in place to make sure he doesn't have any contact directly with those who have accused him? Because as all of us know, that's a trigger. As soon as they see that person, especially walking around freely, it sends a really bad message to them that they weren't believed, it's not important, and all these other psychological harms that continue to occur while he's just walking around and doing this thing. So it's important to have the right people there to go and protect those kids. And it doesn't sound like that happened in that specific case. There are things that can be done. It is incumbent upon the employer to do it. And then when they don't do it, that's when you take legal action against them and kind of force them to do it. And I know a lot of people sometimes look negatively upon lawyers who file these kind of lawsuits. But if we all think about it, a lot of these changes have occurred because of lawsuits. The Boy Scouts and what they do and how they do things completely changed because of their lawsuits. They're in bankruptcy now, but they had perversion files. They had ways of hiding these things. And it wasn't until lawsuits were brought and finally they felt financial pain that all these changes occurred. The Big Brothers Big Sisters Association, for years, people would be able to walk in. I have a case where the perpetrator admitted he walked in and was shown a book of pictures, never filled out a single application. They don't know a thing about him, shown pictures of kids and said, which one do you like? He picked it just based on looks. I mean, it was just, it's ridiculous how they used to operate. And it isn't until these lawsuits are brought that finally changes do occur. And that's sometimes what's required is you have to file these lawsuits. So these organizations will change their practices so other children will not later on in the future become another survivor.
Mm-hmm. That's so good because, one thing we are outraged about here is the statute of limitations. And the reason they won't change it is because it costs too much money. And I think about people who remember or finally come out 25, 26 years later. Do they have a chance of a case? Or is it just if they can still find victims that are being abused right now?
No, in California, if you remember the progression, it used to be that you had until the age of 26. That was our original civil statute of limitations, not criminal. You had the age until 26. So basically they gave you 8 years after you turned 18 to file a lawsuit for any child with sexual abuse. But all the studies and statistics taught us that most people don't come forward within that period of time. The German study talked about, I think the age of 51 was the more average age before someone was able to process what happened to them as children, which takes a lot longer than as an adult, before they're ready and willing to come and tell their story to law enforcement or attorneys or to the judicial system. So eventually California then pushed it up to now 40 years old. And now you had a lot longer period. It still didn't match up with the science and the studies out there that talked about 51. So now there's a bill on Governor Newsom's desk about eliminating all the statute of limitations entirely for child with sexual abuse. Hopefully that will pass. But so we see that there is some progression in the law that's finally kind of catching up with the reality of what we all know and see in this industry of what happens. But to answer your question, absolutely. When they passed AB 218, which was a law passed in the year 2020, it opened up a 3-year window for all child with sexual abuse cases. So within 3 years, from 2020 to December 31, 2022, you could file a civil lawsuit no matter when that child sexual abuse case occurred. And I'll tell you, we had a flood of cases come into the office. People who were even 60s, 70s, finally ready to come forward, were ready to tell their story. We couldn't. Some of those extremely old ones were very difficult to try to figure out a case because a lot of the witnesses had passed away, sadly. Either we can't find them or they've passed away. But some of the other ones, I have lots of cases with people who are in their 40s, 50s, or 60s where we are able to find witnesses. That's why I have my detective as a staff member in the office. He's out there looking for these people. Once you find them, you ask them, and they can corroborate some of what my survivors are saying. Now I have a case. And there is this requirement of independent corroboration that also exists in the civil case. As long as you're making the claim after the age of 40, court will have to review it. I have to put together some corroboration of the claims. It can't just be, and they call it the he said, she said case. As long as I have some form of corroboration, the court will allow me to go forward. I can file these cases. And we filed a bunch of cases when AB 218 had passed. It has since expired. This is not the first time California has opened a window. They call these window statutes. They did it some time ago as well. They had a 1-year window back then. They saw the needs to be, a lot longer than that. So they did 3 years this time. Hopefully they'll eliminate the statute of limitations with this upcoming law, and this won't be needed in the future. But, slowly the law is catching up to reality.
And what would you recommend for a survivor if they come to you and they obviously have been affected by abuse, but they don't necessarily have a case? Maybe it's due to statute of limitations or the lack of corroboration, but they have been affected and there is a perpetrator out there that's still out there. What do you recommend to a survivor, what could they do at that point?
Well, we have lots of those cases where they'll come to us and we can't put together a civil case as hard as we try and as much as we want. And there's a few resources that we have that will help them with. Number one, and most importantly, we always ask about they're in therapy. If they're not, we have resources, free resources. And no one has to even pay for this. There's a lot of organizations that we're familiar with that will offer these resources, therapy for free to a lot of the survivors of sexual abuse. So that's the first thing that we do. We try to get them into therapy, at least get them some help to try to get on their journey to hopefully as best as they can treat and overcome as much as possible some of these things. We know these are lifelong events and traumas for most people, but therapy does help considerably, and we strongly encourage that for our survivors. So that's one thing we can do. Even if we can't go forward with a civil case, we can try to help them and find them some resources for therapy. A lot of people will come in saying, I can't afford to go to a therapist, and they're not even aware of all the resources that are out there that you can get free services, and it is available. So that's one thing. And, the criminal statute of limitations are very different. So sometimes people aren't even aware that I may not be able to do it civilly. There might still be an open criminal statute that they can take advantage of, and we can guide them. I've had many cases where my detective, I still call him detective, even though he's retired, PD, my detective will go with the survivor to the police station as a support person. And that's really important to do, because what we've seen is that, when you go to the police station, you're often in front of this patrol officer who has no specific training of how to deal with a sexual assault survivor. And oftentimes they will blow off that survivor and tell them, oh, it's a civil case. Why don't you go find yourself a civil lawyer? That's completely wrong. They're required to take a report. I've had so many cases where I would get calls from the survivors saying, I tried to go make a police report. They didn't even take a report. And, nothing angers me more than that. And I will send my detective out with them, who is, a former sex crimes detective, knows all the rules, knows all the laws, and they can't do that with him there. And, we've had cases where one specific case where I ended up filing the civil case as well, but she came to me, we encouraged her to file a criminal report. She did. And before any civil action was taken, she wanted to do that for herself. And she went, and initially she asked to file a police report. They said, no, it's not appropriate. Statute of limitations had expired, which was wrong. The patrol officer had no idea what the statute of limitations actually was for these sex crime cases. And after I sent my detective out and they finally took a report, not only did they take a report, when it got to a sex crimes detective in that agency, they realized it is a valid case. They ended up filing criminal charges against that perpetrator. That perpetrator got convicted. And then afterwards, later on, we ended up doing a civil action, and we got a civil settlement as well. So, but that survivor, if they didn't have the proper support, would have never gotten a police report taken, would have never had a civil case, and that perpetrator would have continued just roaming around doing whatever they wanted to do. And that's why, we offer that as well. If we can't help you, if there is a criminal option, we will send our detective to help you file that police report. He knows, the process to go through that, and he's there for support. And what we've seen oftentimes, these patrol officers, the way they ask questions can sometimes be damaging as well. They don't even know how to ask the questions. Sometimes it's accusatory, but it doesn't happen as frequently when my detective is sitting right there and can stop them too when they're starting to go off track. Oftentimes he'll request a trained sex crimes detective, but even if they're not available, he's there to make sure that these kind of wrong, accusatory type of questions just stop if they're going to, these patrol officers don't know any better. And that's the other thing. It'd be great if they got a lot more training in law enforcement, especially if their survivors are required to go through a patrol officer before they get to a trained sex crimes detective who does know how to ask questions more appropriately. But right now, we don't quite have that.
I wanted to ask you about this too. A lot of the interviews that we do on these guys do on No Longer Ashamed is they are a victim of abuse. And then it becomes this pattern of drugs and alcohol, and they get into trouble because they're self-medicating to stop the shame and so forth. And then eventually they get such addiction issues and this, that, and the other, where they end up incarcerated. And then they come out of that, and finally, but once they told their story, they all of a sudden had this freedom. And I have a friend that he worked in the jail system, and he said he goes, I can't say that everyone in jail has been, a sexual abuse case, but he goes, 100% of the guys that I have worked with, and he was a pastor, he goes, I have worked with have been sexually abused. And they were all recovering addiction issues and stuff like that. And, I imagine there's kind of a sticky situation there where you have, if someone came to you and they were had been incarcerated or in trouble, you had to, represent them in some way. And then you find out that their backstory is abuse and shame. And then it just seems like it all so much leads to each other, the problems of that. And I agree, getting more people the knowledge of how to handle that. And I really appreciate that your wife is on board with being a trained therapist and so forth, because that's one thing that we do get too. Do you have people that we can talk to, or, whatever like that on this stuff? So being able to refer.
Yeah, we see that all the time. And the problem is, I think a lot of survivors think, okay, because, I used to do drugs, I went to prison, no one's going to believe me now. My character is ruined, my credibility is gone. And that's the perception that they have. And that's one of the other reasons. Maybe there's a lot of reasons, but there's one of the other reasons why they don't even want to come forward or even attempt to ask a lawyer to see if they have a case. But, if you've done this long enough, you see, just like you said, this is a reoccurring pattern. We see it all the time. And I flipped the script. I actually use that to help prove my case. That helps prove that this actually happened. And what we do in a lot of these cases, what I think is critical to be done, is I hire psychologists, experts in this field, to come and testify in my cases about what I call the rape myths or sexual assault myths that are out there. And a lot of people don't understand why people don't report. And everyone thinks, well, if you're a victim of crime, if someone robbed you, what's the first thing you do? You dial 911. That's not how a survivor thinks when it's a sexual assault. But people don't understand that or appreciate that. So you need to bring an expert in to explain all this to a jury. And then they hear the case, and now they got a better understanding of it. The fact that it leads to drug abuse and some sort of substance abuse is a very common pattern. And it actually helps prove the fact that something traumatic happened to this individual. And having an expert testify about that actually flips the script. It's no longer, well, you can't trust this individual. They used to be a drug addict or they went to prison. It's, you understand the reason that they had all these experiences because there was a trauma in their life. And what's that trauma that happened to them? Well, here's some evidence of the sexual abuse. It really ties it all together. In my mind, it helps corroborate it. And if you have the right people explaining all this to a jury, then it starts making a lot more sense. So it's no longer, oh, he's a former drug addict or he's a bad person, he went to prison. Well, there's a reason behind all that. And trauma is that reason. And, we're learning new things all the time. There's this doctor out in, I think, San Francisco, who's doing a lot of studies and they're looking at the brain and they're able to show, especially for children, a multiple trauma exposure to sexual assault actually changes the biology and the physiology of the brain. And they're able to now show that. And now we approach it a little differently. This is kind of a novel way of going about these type of cases. We approach it as a brain injury case. It's no longer just an emotional injury because people have this aversion towards emotional injury. How do I value it? I don't know what to think about it. It's not just an emotional injury, psychological injury. It's a physical injury. It's a physical injury to the brain. All of these things that occur, these PTSDs, these nightmares, and their change of the personality, their abuse of drugs, a lot of it is because of that. Whatever happens in the brain to them as children, it gets rewired and causes all these effects. So if you approach it from that perspective, sometimes jurors have a better appreciation. Oh, well, it's a physical injury. I get it now versus a psychological injury. It's new. It's kind of not frequently used. And it's a new science, if you will, out there showing that there has been these changes in these brains. And the more we learn about it, I think the more we'll be understanding of the effects of this trauma and not to look down upon someone who ends up in prison or substance abuse. It isn't because they wanted to go that route. It's because that trauma led them to that route.
Mm-hmm.
That's so true. So one of the things I'm feeling from what you're saying is that even if you're a survivor and even if you feel like you might not have a case, even if you feel like you don't have evidence, it's important to report it, if only to help corroborate for possibly in case someone else has reported or in case someone else will report in the future. Even if you don't think you have a case, it could help corroborate a future case and possibly put that perpetrator, get some justice.
Well, 100% correct. And that's what I tell anybody who calls our office or my survivors, my clients that come to me. Sometimes we may not even be able to help them, but they might be able to help someone else. Yeah. In the future. And just by having that documented, we'll provide that independent corroboration. So that prosecutor we're looking for the other evidences of corroboration. If sometimes they exist, they want something solid. Well, another report from a completely unrelated survivor or victim will be that independent corroboration for the future to get that perpetrator hopefully off the streets.
And I think one of the things is a lot of survivors don't necessarily want to report because they're afraid of actually going to trial and what that means for them, having to face the defendant, having to face the defendant's attorney, or even, a lot of men don't want anyone to know this happened to them. And so they don't want to go to any extent but is there a way of reporting without having to actually go to trial or is there a way of just reporting just to have a report based on that?
You can do that. Yeah. And it's unique to survivors of sexual abuse. A lot of people don't appreciate this, but a lot of people think it's my criminal case and I can decide whether charges are going to be filed or not. And that's not true. The district attorney's office has the right to file charges whether you choose to do so or not.
Yeah.
This pretty much comes into play when we're talking about domestic violence survivors and victims. A lot of domestic violence victims don't want charges filed, but it's not up to them. It's the state of California that's making that decision, and the state of California wants this violent person off the streets. So the DA's office will make that decision. However, for survivors of sexual abuse, there's actually a penal code that says that you can't hold them in contempt if they refuse to testify. It's only for sexual abuse because we know the psychological harms are very different than domestic violence survivor. So for that group of people, you can report and you can tell the police at the end of the day, I don't want to prosecute. I just want you to know that this exists. Now, to some degree, you can do that, but at some later point, when there is a criminal prosecution, they are going to need you as a witness in that case. Maybe you're not the named victim anymore, but you are a witness and you have to testify to the harms that occurred anyways. You can't just have it in a document. You need live witness testimony. There's hearsay objections if you try to present any out-of-court statements. So at some point, that person has to be ready and available to come to court. And that's where therapy comes into play. I think if they haven't had any type of therapy, getting them to therapy right away, working with a really good therapist who is trained in these type of things can help get that person ready to face the requirements of court and the really daunting requirements of court.
Yeah.
Well, and you brought this up before that often victims end up re-victimized. And that's why we were so thrilled about finding you, because it really makes a difference. And even what you said about sending your detective with them to file. I work with homeless women and women coming out of drug addiction. Well, what happens is they just think, nobody's going to believe me. I'm a hoe. I'm an addict. And yet often that's why they're there. And then they're abused and hurt, and good community, I'm using quotes, people trying to help them will re-victimize them and say, well, who's going to believe you?
Yeah. And, the system itself requires re-victimization. And every time I have a new client that calls me, and before I ask them to tell their story, I tell them, I'm sorry. You are going to be triggered. You're going to be re-traumatized right now, but I have no better way right now of getting around it. I need to know your story. So I start with that warning, at least an appreciation for I know what they're going to be going through, but there's honestly no other way. The criminal justice system, they're understanding it more, especially with children. They have this desire. It doesn't happen every single time. The right detective, well-trained detective, will go through a forensic process. And when they do that, there's forensic centers all throughout LA County with trained psychologists who will do the one and only interview, and they'll videotape. So all the parties who are interested, which is the detective, the prosecuting agency, we don't have these multiple interviews like we are to do. It's usually the patrol officer will interview you, then you go to a sex crime detective, second interview. Then if there seems to be a case, you have to take them. And that was a rule. I had to interview all the people before I filed a case, all of the survivors. So the DA has to interview you now. There's 3 interviews at a minimum. And now there's this understanding, especially with children, we can try to eliminate that. As soon as there's a report, don't send the patrol officer. Try to get them to a forensic interview with a psychologist who's trained to interview children, videotape it, and let's just do one time interview and, not subject the child to multiple interviews. It doesn't happen again all the time, but when it does happen, it's the right way of doing it. And hopefully it'll happen more and more as people get better trained in this field.
Yeah. I think that's the one thing I've heard people say, I've already been through it once, I'm not bringing it up again. But what we're discovering is when people do share their story, they get a sense of freedom. And when you were talking about you could file, but not say, I don't want to go forward. But with counseling in that, they may walk through a process where by the time it gets to where they're like, what, there's 10 other people? Okay, I'm in.
Yeah. And you do see that oftentimes. And there's strength in numbers when they find out they're not alone. And sadly, the society, we're all trained to blame the survivor. They must have done something to put themselves in that situation. Right. Even if they can ask for it, they did something to put themselves in the situation. That's the mentality a lot of survivors have, and it's because of our society norms, our expectations. What's the first thing that if someone is a victim of robbery, no one would ever question, well, what'd you do to cause that robbery to occur?
Or what were you wearing?
Yeah, who cares what you were wearing? But what's the first thing when someone says, I'm a victim of sexual assault? There's always that doubt, like, really, what did happen? What's the other side of the story? But you never ask that in a robbery victim because that's how society trains. And survivors of sexual abuse know that's what society has. That's their expectation. That's the norms out there. And so there's where the shame and the guilt and the self-doubt all comes in because, well, what did I do to put myself in that situation? And that's where the hesitation comes in. And then you have the delayed reporting. And then when you have delayed reporting, you got the defense yelling and screaming, well, it can't be real victims of crime because anybody who's a real victim of crime calls the police right away. And I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that. Sorry for saying the word crap, but that is really what it is.
Yeah.
That's what we hear over and over again, but we all know the reality. Unfortunately, most jurors don't. And that's why I try to bring in a trained psychologist almost in every one of my cases to train those jurors. But what really happens in these type of cases? And hopefully most of the time that works.
I feel like there's a book in you to help the general community because all the things that you're saying are warming my heart because I just think of not only myself, but the women that I've walked through this with and the not being believed, not being supported, pulling up all their past bad behavior, and just the things that allow the perpetrator to continue to get away with it. And I think we can't really categorize crime. One's better than the other. But when it's against children,
yeah,
it's horrendous.
And the perpetrators so often, like you're saying, they will use that doubt of the thing, of the act or whatever. And they say, well, you liked it. You were aroused. And we have a great guy that we've interviewed and he's part of our group. Dr. Doug Carpenter has written a book and he devotes a chapter to the difference between arousal and desire. Cause especially male to male, there is so much shame. And and there's wonder, am I gay? Am I straight? What's going on? I don't desire, but and they'll use that. You were aroused. And so they feel like they're powerless. The victim feels powerless at that point and doesn't talk and doesn't say anything, especially if it's family member or something like that. So just to have the empowerment is so important.
And you're right. We see it a lot in male to male, but also I remember a case I prosecuted. It was a young teenage female girl abused by her female volleyball coach. Mm-hmm. And people don't appreciate the ramifications of that. This young lady at some point, after several years of trying to deal with this, attempted to commit suicide. Mm-hmm. That's how deeply impacted she was. And I remember she would tell me that since she was abused by this female coach, she never had any prior sexual experiences. She was confused. She didn't know whether she's gay, whether she's straight. And that confusion, especially in a child's mind, they don't know how to process that, leads to such ramifications like she wanted to kill herself. Mm-hmm. And people just don't have that appreciation. They think about what you just said. And she even admitted, it felt good. And that's what led even to a deeper confusion. Well, if it's wrong, why is it feeling good? And children just, again, don't know how to process that. And the general society, they look at it and they kind of just brush that off. Well, it's just another sexual experience. They'll get over it. Well, they don't. They're children, and the way they process is very different than adults. And the ramifications are pretty large. And that one, girl, thank God, She didn't do it. She thought about it, but that's just shows the seriousness of this and what it can do to a child's mind. And again, it's just so important that you brought up, Lori, the effect on children. It has a very different effect on children. The way they process this information is very different than an adult. And they process it in such a different way that it leads to such horrible consequences, oftentimes for the rest of their lives. Mm-hmm. And getting in early and getting treatment in early, at least in my experience, I see that it does have some positive effects. But, when you don't know and the child doesn't report, they keep the big secret. And it isn't until they're, in their 40s and 50s, well, all the damage has already been done. And it's much more difficult to try to get them some form of healing than if we can intervene early on in that child's life and immediately get them into some sort of therapy. There will be hopefully some better healing and they won't suffer for the rest of their lives like we often see.
Yeah, I really like the fact that on your website, you do have signs of abuse in children and so forth. What to look for in children and what to look for in adults, possible signs of abuse, and also what to look for if you're sending your child to a coach or to camp or so forth, how to be aware of the signs of possible abuse, because it's so important because, like we say, it's so hard for children to report this. But as a parent or a guardian or a friend, what you can look for, it's so important to be able to be aware.
And it's sometimes the smallest things. One case that had a really deep impact on me as now a parent, I have 2 children of my own, and I'll never forget this one survivor and her story, because I remember it now as a parent. I make sure I don't make this mistake, but it's a mistake that any parent would naturally make. It was involving I was involved with the Catholic scandal and priest abuse cases. I was doing a lot of those, and this survivor was a survivor of a Catholic priest abuse. And what happened in her case is that her dad would make this comment that I think a lot of us just offhand make, if anybody, honey, hurts you, I'll kill them. And that child heard that over and over again. And when she was abused, she actually processed this in her mind. Well, I can't tell my dad because if I do, he's going to go out and kill him, and then he's going to go to jail. So she kept that secret because she believed that literal statement. Obviously, it wasn't meant to be literal, but that's not how a child took it. And when she told her story in front of her dad, I mean, I still get emotional when I think about it, that how her dad reacted, like, that one offhand remark prevented her child from getting help early on, and how powerful that was. And as a parent, you got to be a little bit careful about what you say. These offhand remarks, children take it literally. You have to have that conversation with them. And it's so important to have that conversation about the appropriate judge, and no secrets. And anybody tells you it's a secret is not, someone who's a friend. You need to tell a parent. And you have to have all this conversation with children, because these offhand remarks that sometimes we make, we don't even think about. Look at the ramifications that it had on that one child.
Yeah.
So
it's so
that story will stick with me, to today. It still sticks with me.
That's so good. Yeah, we hear fight, flight, fawn, freeze, and now someone is adding face it to it, that people want to judge the victim by their response. But as we know, we don't respond typically. And often the victim will go into a protective mode if it is a family member, because they know they won't be believed, or they're afraid that person will get in trouble, so it's just so sad how manipulating a child like that. And then when they become adults, they're still thinking like a child. They forget, I'm an adult now, and he can't hurt me anymore. So,
especially if they get the proper therapy and they do process it incorrectly. And that's where the therapy comes in, where hopefully if it's an experienced therapist who works with abused children, sexually abused children, they can learn not to do that as an adult. So it's, in my mind, it's very critical to get them help. Their journey to healing, as we like to say, starts with getting into therapy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So good. Well, we're almost out of time. Were you going to ask something, Kevin?
No, I just wanted to thank you so much for all that you're doing, especially for bringing awareness to this, and especially the awareness of symptoms of abuse, what to look for. There's so much that people just aren't aware of that can really help children now, or even adults that are survivors. And I'm just very thankful for what you're doing. And I'm so glad that there is someone like you doing this, because this is how we can change what has happened to these
Yeah.
kids, to these adults.
If the victim can
Thank you
feel
for
safe
your-
when they come forward.
There'll
Yeah,
be
thank you for your kind words, but you guys are doing the same thing. I mean, if it wasn't for your podcast to spread this word, that's what we need to do. We need to change the way society thinks about these cases and reacts to these cases. And it starts with talking about it. And that's what you guys are doing. So I thank you for what you do as well.
Well, I'm excited to get the website updated. We have a guy that is Nathan, and he's written a book. He's just on fire to just get this out there and aware and people aware of it. And he did a TED Talk and he's really getting after it. I think it is making it aware. It's also the understanding with other victims that you're not alone. Other people have gone, I had that same feeling, or I experienced that too, that he went through, and there's been so many amazing stories come up with No Longer Ashamed that we just hope and pray that it just continues to get out there and spread and people can find us and get help.
Before we go, Sam, we have just loved everything you've had to say, but what would you really want people to know? What do you want people to walk away with?
I think a lot of the society thinks with the Me Too movement, we made a lot of progress and okay, now we're ready to move on past the Me Too movement. And we did. I don't want to minimize the effect of Me Too. It did have a pretty significant effect, but I still try cases in front of juries and I still hear these myths that are still out there. These societal norms still exist. The standard that we hold a sexual assault survivor, we expect you to act this way if you really were a survivor. It's these kind of mentality and these norms that we still need to change. There's still a lot of work to be done. We're not over the Me Too movement. It was great while it lasted. And I think it's kind of waning a little bit. There's still so much more that we as a society need to change to give these survivors a chance, because the effect of sexual abuse is a lifelong effect, and it really shouldn't, but it is. And until we change as a society, I don't think these survivors are going to have a chance to hopefully find their healing and not suffer for the rest of their lives. So I'm hoping at some point through conversations like this, the constant education of society, that we do change the way we look at these type of cases and our expectations and the standards of sexual abuse survivors, and not just question the minute we hear it's a sexual abuse case, what's the other side of the story? And that's what bothers me the most, probably.
Yeah.
We always say, if somebody comes to you and tells you a story like that, first thing you say is, I believe you. Start
I believe
there.
you, and how can I help you? What can I do to help you? Rather than question them or there's so many things that makes it hard for a survivor to actually tell their story. And the first time they tell it can be so critical. It can either boost them or it can totally crush them.
Yeah. Send them into another 26 years.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. We're so
Thank you,
grateful
Sam.
for your work, and thank you for coming on. And boy, you just gave us so much good stuff today. Thank you.
Yes.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
So that's it for today.
We are going to have a prayer time if you want to stick with us. If not, we believe in you.
We want to hear from you. We want to hear your stories.
If you like this podcast, please rate and review, because that's how other people can find us. And we really want to spread this message.
Father, I just thank you for all your blessings. And I pray that you would bless their law group, you would bless the work they're doing, and that they would continue to help survivors, help people get the justice, and help the awareness. Lord, we just pray for more awareness of this issue and more awareness of why there are so many problems reporting. Just pray for more men and women to be able to come forward, to tell their stories, Lord. I just pray for their stories to come out, so that would open the door for more people to tell their stories and to get the healing they deserve, Lord. And I just pray for your blessing on those survivors that will hear this and will have the courage to come forward, and just give them that courage, Lord. In your name I pray.
Lord, I just really thank you for just the steps and the plain path that you made for us. And Lord, we just come to you now, and we just want to stand in the gap for survivors. And Lord, that we would be aware, that you would heighten our awareness so that we will be open to hearing a story, and that you will bring people in our path and help us to be sensitive and be able to help with the needs that need to be met, Lord. And all this information, Lord, yes, I pray blessing on Sam and his group and the law group there and what he's doing, Lord. And I just pray that you would bless his family and everything. And I just pray, Lord, that you would continue to protect survivors. I pray that you would bring down the perpetrators, Lord. And I just pray that you would bless us as we go forth the rest of this week. Bless our time, Glory's time when she goes to this conference. And I just bless Kevin and I's time as well. And Lord, we just pray that you would oversee all the steps and bring us the people you want us to keep working with and interview. In Jesus' name.
Father, I also pray your blessing on Sam's group. And Father, I just thank you for the awareness and the education that he's doing. And Lord, that Father, that this would be the thing that might encourage someone to come forward and to speak their truth, Lord, and that we know that you have opened this door for us to use this platform. And I just pray that you will help us to know our next steps and how to be there, how to support people, and what you would have from this. Bring us the next people, Lord. I thank you for the work that Char's doing, that opening up these doors to other avenues of this kind of abuse, and that we can put it out there for people, not only education, but, that might stir people to share their stories as well, Lord. And I thank you that I'm so sad that people have to suffer. I'm so sad that kids get hurt, but I thank you that there can be healing. And I pray that there will be more people to fight this fight and be in the battle. In your son's holy name, amen.
Amen.